Video games have been around for a few decades now, and in that time span, they have always evolved with the changing times and technologies, from arcade classics to the blockbusters of today. Video games have transformed themselves again and again over the years, which leaves us with a question: what is the best year in gaming history? Was it the year that Nintendo saved the industry in the 80s? Was it the year that saw multiple genre-defining classics released over the course of 12 months? What about the year where online multiplayer truly became a force to be reckoned with? I'm Caboose with the Leaderboard, and we're gonna delve through video history to search for the best year in gaming. Before we dive into some of the best years in video game history, let's set some conditions for ourselves. Point number one being that the best year in gaming is not exclusively about which video games came out that year. Those are important, of course, don't get me wrong, but console launches and changing trends in the gaming landscape are also big factors. For example, you may have never used Xbox Live, but it's hard to deny the impact the popularization of online gaming on consoles had on the gaming industry. Point number two, when talking about video game releases, we are focused only on their original versions. The exception is with arcade games because their console ports have proven to be incredibly valuable to gaming history. And then our last point, you may ask yourself, but Caboose, isn't the best year in gaming the current year because we have access to all of the games and consoles released in previous years? To which I say, you must be really fun at parties. Yeah, okay. We're looking for the best individual year in gaming, separate from the years that came before it. With that out of the way, let's begin by starting with the earliest candidate for best year in gaming, look at why it's in contention, and work our way up to the present day. And to do that, we're gonna have to start by going back to the 80s. 1980 to be exact. It's the first year in video game history where video games truly began to be more than just a simple fad. Though it had come out a few years before, the Atari 2600 was rapidly growing in popularity thanks to a number of arcade ports that were arriving on the console. Chief among them was Space Invaders, which was the first console game to sell 1 million copies. 1980 was also the year that the Atari released Missile Command, which is both one of the greatest games of all time, as well as a chilling manifestation of how the Cold War affected pop culture. It's about stopping nuclear missiles from destroying American cities, which is a topic that is rather lightheartedly presented in the game. If you want lighter fare, you don't have to look far. Nintendo was a few years away from becoming a major player in the industry, but 1980 saw the release of the original Game & Watch series of handheld games. Meanwhile, Activision released its first games ever, all of which launched on the 2600. This is more important in terms of it being the first releases for one of the biggest publishing companies today, because let's be real, most of the games they made at this time were nothing special. And no mention of 1980 would be complete without talking about the first ever video game mascot, Pac-Man. To this day, it remains one of the best-selling games of all time, and its original arcade release was a smash hit. I mean, what other games have spawned a Billboard Top 10 single? Seriously, Pac-Man single-handedly makes 1980 worth talking about when it comes to the best years in video game history. Though, funnily enough, the next year that's up for debate also has one that left a huge mark in the industry. Can you guess what came out in 1985? Good to see you, Mario. We're happy to have you. 1985 marked the launch of the NES in North America, revitalizing the home console market after the crash of 1983. Its success was in no small part due to the game that launched alongside it, Super Mario Bros. What can we say about it that hasn't already been said? The original Super Mario Bros. Is simply one of the greatest platformers ever made. The introduction of the NES also saw the release of Excite Bike and Duck Hunt, two of the most iconic games of this era. And outside of the Nintendo space, a ton of classic games were released this year. These include arcade classics Ghosts and Goblets and Gauntlets. Over on PCs, we've got games like Oregon Trail. In other words, Nintendo didn't just carry this year, but without it, 1985 would not have been as great. It's also the last year in the 80s that is a candidate for best year in gaming, and it'll be over a decade before we get another year in video game history that deserves a place in that discussion. Yeah, you heard me, we're gonna be skipping the first half of the 90s. Now, before you get your pitchforks out, let me explain. We're not skipping the first half of the 90s because the years were bad or average for gaming. On the contrary, the early 90s were fantastic fantastic for video games. Sega entered the console scene and introduced the world to Sonic the Hedgehog. The Super Nintendo launched and over its lifespan would be home to multiple all-time classics. The Game Boy became a cultural icon and revolutionized the handheld gaming market, and PC games like Wolfenstein and Doom pioneered the first-person shooter genre. The trouble with the first half of the 90s is that there really isn't one year that stands out. The era is great, but these games and consoles were released over a period of years, and no one year in particular rises above the rest. The closest we get is arguably 1994, which saw the launch of Sony's PlayStation in Japan, as well as the release of classic games like Final Fantasy VI, Donkey Kong Country, and Super Metroid. Those games are great, but 1994 is overshadowed by the era in which it launched. If this was a video about what the greatest generation in video game history is, the 16-bit era is arguably the best, but in terms of the best individual year, sorry, but nothing in the early 90s is making the cut. What does make the cut is 1996, aka the year when 3D gaming really began to get popular.
It's me, Mario! Hello!
Let's start with Nintendo because it always seems to be critical to video game history. 1996 saw the company launch the Nintendo 64 as a successor to the SNES, and while it wasn't as big of a success as its predecessor, with fewer games even approaching the realm of greatness, the ones that did were important. Case in point, Super Mario 64. It wasn't the first 3D platformer, but boy was it the first truly great one. Super Mario 64 set the conventions for both 3D platformers and 3D games in general, thanks to its innovative camera controls. Elsewhere, the PlayStation was picking up momentum as games like Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, and Crash Bandicoot helped Sony grow its fanbase. In the handheld space, the most important handheld game of all time made its debut in Japan, Pokemon, a smash hit from the get-go. Its subsequent American release a few years later made it a cultural phenomenon. And over on PCs, Quake made its entrance into the first-person shooter space as Command & Conquer Red Alert continued to grow real-time strategy games. 1996 would prove to be a great year for video games, but unfortunately, 1996 isn't even the best year for gaming in the 90s. That would come 2 years later. 1998 may well have been the strongest case for being the best year in gaming history. Though things were quiet on the hardware side, 1998 saw the release of some of the greatest and most influential video games of all time. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, one of the greatest games ever, and that's a fact, is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to games that came out that year.
No, there's no need for words, Snake. I'm Psycho Mantis! That's right. This is no trick. It's true power.
Metal Gear Solid revitalized a franchise and took video game storytelling to a whole new level.
Get away from the shutting down. Attempt to shut down. It's done.
Half-Life revolutionized first-person shooters and made Valve into the juggernaut that it is today.
Round 1, fight.
Tekken 3 is an amazing fighting game and is perhaps the most important 3D fighter ever. StarCraft was the apex of real-time strategy and made Blizzard a major player in the industry. And as mentioned earlier, Pokemon Red and Blue took America by storm when it launched this year. That's just the start of it. Here's some other great games that happened to come out that year. Resident Evil 2, Grim Fandango, Banjo-Kazooie, Baldur's Gate, Thief, The Dark Project, Final Fantasy Tactics, Suikoden 2, Parasite Eve, Spyro the Dragon, Xenogears, Fallout 2, Rainbow Six. I could go on, but you get the point. 1998 is such a good year for gaming that it's hard to see anything challenging it. That being said, there are a few more years to get through. As the 90s gave way to a new millennium, a new console generation arose in 2001. While the PlayStation 2 came out a year before, two consoles launched in 2001, each with a killer title ready to go. Nintendo followed up the N64 with the GameCube, releasing Super Smash Bros. Melee as its marquee title for the holiday season. Meanwhile, Microsoft got in on the console game with the original Xbox, and they definitely got started on the right foot with Halo Combat Evolved, which broke open the door for first-person shooters to dominate consoles in the 2000s. Though the PS2 didn't launch this year, it did have one big third-party release, Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto 3. Controversial as it may be, the game popularized open-world video games and birthed a franchise that remains one of the most profitable in video game history.
You're an efficient killer. I like that in a man.
But 2001 wasn't all about these big name titles, it was also about Sega's departure as a console manufacturer. As sad as that news was for fans, there was a happy consequence. Sega's games could now make their way to other consoles as the company focused on software from that point on. Moving along, the next year that is in contention for the best year in gaming is also one that, much like 1998, saw the release of several influential and important games that have left their mark on the industry. That year is 2004, and there's only one game that we can really start with.
Master Chief, you mind telling me what you're doing on that ship?
Sir, finishing this fight.
Sorry, Halo 2 was popular, but more importantly, set the bar for multiplayer gaming from that point on. Its matchmaking system, with its playlists and parties, became the industry standard. Sure, the single-player experience was divisive, but its multiplayer was incredibly influential. Speaking of multiplayer, Blizzard revolutionized MMOs with World of Warcraft in 2004. Its quest system and well-designed world set a standard for MMOs that countless developers have been chasing after since. It's one of the most popular PC games ever, and its longevity speaks to how much of an impact it had in gaming. Elsewhere, 2004 saw the release of fantastic game after fantastic game. Grand Theft Auto continued to be the hottest franchise around with GTA San Andreas. Half-Life 2 proved that Valve was one of the best developers in the business, and Hideo Kojima once again showed that he could create experiences unlike any other with Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. What also made 2004 an important year was the launch of two handhelds, the Nintendo DS and Sony's PlayStation Portable. The DS is arguably the greatest handheld console ever made, and yes, I know that may be a hot take to some, but it would go on to be the best-selling Nintendo console and handheld system of all time, so it's difficult to argue against it. Meanwhile, the PSP would go on to sell 80 million units and show that Nintendo didn't have to be the only handheld console maker in town. Of course, Sony doesn't make handhelds anymore, but let's not talk about that. Our next year up for contention is 2007. While 2004 may have dominated by sequels to games and franchises that already exist, 2007 was a time for new games to shine. BioShock was one such game. The immersive sim showed that single-player shooters could both sell millions of copies and be critically acclaimed. BioWare's Mass Effect launched a new franchise with an original sci-fi setting that was captivating for players. Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed may have evolved into something entirely different in the current year, but its original release was an exciting stealth game. And though Sony initially stumbled with the PlayStation 3's launch, Uncharted would help stabilize the console as it birthed a new franchise. Apart from some of these original games though, there were some sequels that left a big mark that year. God of War continued to be as over-the-top violent as ever with its sequel. Halo 3 ended the original trilogy in Halo and continued to make Xbox Live a must-have, especially with its map-making Forge mode. And Valve finally got around to releasing Half-Life 3. Oh no, that's not right. It's Team Fortress 2 with the Orange Box collection, which also introduced the world to one of the greatest games ever, Portal.
Well, you found me. Congratulations. Was it worth it? Because despite your violent behavior, the only thing you've managed to break so far is my heart.
2007 was also when we were introduced to Rock Band and Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, two games that were immensely popular and influential in the years to come. Then there's Nintendo. The Wii released the year before and was still incredibly difficult to find on store shelves, but if you could experience one of the best 3D platformers ever with Super Mario Galaxy. In short, 2007 was a year where no matter where you looked for what console you played on, there were great games for you to play, and how many years in gaming history can match that? Well, I'll be damned, 2013 certainly tried. The year is most notable for being the last gasp of the previous console generation, as both the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 would launch that year, and while those consoles are important, what really stole the show that year were the games that came out to cap off the 7th console generation. Take The Last of Us as an example. Sony ended the PS3 era with a bang thanks to an emotional story set in a post-apocalyptic world, and it remains one of the most acclaimed games of all time. BioShock Infinite, while not as memorable as the first BioShock, left its own mark as the series took to the skies. Nintendo's 3DS was finally starting to show what it was capable of with the release of Fire Emblem Awakening and The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, but no mention of 2013 would be complete without talking about the most popular acclaimed game to come out that year, of course that game being Grand Theft Auto 5.
My psychotic best friend shows up out of nowhere.
Nobody tells me what I want!
To torture me over mistakes I made over a decade ago.
Rockstar's latest entry into the Grand Theft Auto franchise is nothing short of being a massive success. Its single-player component was well received, but it was Grand Theft Auto Online that truly made GTA 5 memorable, roaming around a wide open world with dozens of other players engaging in shootouts, races, and plenty of activities. There really isn't anything quite like it. To this day, GTA Online brings in about $1 billion a year to Rockstar. Dislike it if you want, but few games ever reach that level of success. Plus, I think we all know where we were at this exact moment in 2013 when we were stuck in those infinite loading lobbies for GTA Online when it first released. But is selling a lot of copies and making a ton of money really something that qualifies as a major factor for the best year in gaming? It plays a part, clearly, but it's not the be-all and end-all for what makes a year in gaming great. Quality and industry impact also matter, and with that in mind, that brings us to the final year that's in contention for being the best year in gaming history, 2017. We have to start with Nintendo because they are a major factor in the year's importance. The Nintendo Switch launched in March 2017, and by the end of the year, it had completely changed the company's reputation around after the middling Wii U era. The dual nature of the console as both a portable and home device contributed greatly to its success. This was in no small part due to the release of two amazing games for it, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey. Both are among the greatest games in their respective franchises, with the former being a reinvention of Zelda's adventure mechanics and the other being simply a fantastic platformer. Outside of the Nintendo sphere, you have other great games like Nier Automata, Horizon Zero Dawn, Persona 5, and Divinity Original Sin 2 launching in the same year. But if we're talking in terms of influential games, we have to mention PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. It popularized the Battle Royale genre and arguably was one of the most popular games that year. It even had an imitator 6 months after its early access release, Fortnite Battle Royale. PUBG spawned an entirely new genre of games, in the process becoming one of the most important games of the 2010s. Looking back, what makes an individual year for gaming better than others varies. Sometimes it's because it has a major impact on the industry, see 1985. Other times, it's because a lot of really great games came out that year. 2007 is a fantastic example of that. But I would wager that the best years, the ones that truly matter for gaming, are the ones that have a mixture of both. Years like 1998, 2004, and 2017 all fit the bill in that regard. We're not going to make a definitive statement one way or the other. The answer to what the best year in gaming differs from person to person. We just want to know what some of the strongest candidates are. What really is the best year in gaming is ultimately up to you to decide. Thanks for watching The Leaderboard, and let us know what you think the best year in gaming is and why in the comments below. And if you want to watch more videos like this, be sure to like and subscribe for all of our latest content. I've been Caboose with The Leaderboard, and we'll see you next time.